Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And like everyone else in this House, I'll be making a contribution. And so we cannot be reminded enough of the importance of the decision that we are going to make over the course of this debate today and in the next fortnight. This is an emotional issue, and so many of us have experienced the illness, suffering and death of a loved one, and now all of us, I think, have been in that position. And in my own family, we've been no different. And for our family, we were all present at the end of my grandmother's life, where she was in a vulnerable, incapacitated state at home. And we were so fortunate that she was able to receive the very best of end-of-life palliative care. And that's something our family will forever be grateful for. And I know the member for Chafey in his contribution touched on the importance of that and witnessing that, and the member for Davenport and so many others in this community, in this place. I don't think any of us wants to see our family or friends suffer at the end of life. And this is such a difficult debate for so many of us. But we as legislators need to judge the legislation on what is actually printed on the pages before us and what these changes will mean if they become law. And we are tasked with legislating for indeed the well-being and safety of all South Australians. And we must look at this through that prism of shared values, foundational principles, love and compassion, as I think as the member for Wright alluded to so well in his contribution, and how it will impact on our entire state now and into the future, because this bill impacts on each and every one of us. Paul Keating, former Prime Minister, made some remarks as part of the 2017 Victorian debate, and he went on to say, and I quote, "Once this bill is passed, the expectations of patients and families will change. The culture of dying will gradually permeate into our medical, health, social and institutional arrangements. Opposition to this bill is not about religion, it is about the civilisation ethic that should be at the heart of our secular society. In public life, it is the principles that matter. They define the norms and values of a society, and in this case, the principles concern our human life itself. It is a mistake for legislators to act on the deeply held emotional concerns of many when that involves crossing a threshold that will affect the entire society into perpetuity," to end the quote from Paul Keating. And I believe his words and many words that he made in those remarks are true in this debate, and that's why we should tread with an abundance of caution as we go through this debate, and importantly as we embark on the committee stage, where we'll be looking at many of the clauses and how they will actually work in practical effect for South Australians should that become law. One of my key passions for me ever since being in this place, and of course it is National Palliative Care Week, is around the provision of palliative care services in South Australia. And there is always going to be a big interface with palliative care services, end of life, and any end of life legislation that comes through with it. So according to the AMA, for most patients, and I quote, "At the end of life, pain and other causes of suffering can be alleviated through the provision of good quality end-of-life care, including palliative care, that focus on symptom relief, the prevention of suffering and improvement of quality of life." The AMA also admits that palliative care can vary throughout Australia, and we must ensure that no individual requests euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide simply because they are unable to access this care. When people are dying, they need tender, loving care, support, and unfortunately, we too often fail in this objective. Surely, before we embrace euthanasia, governments should be doing everything they can to improve palliative care options and access to them, especially in regional South Australia. This means ensuring adequate resourcing, support for research and development, and ensuring our doctors and nurses are more aware of palliative care options for their patients. We know that the majority of South Australians want to die at home, surrounded by their families. It means our public health networks need to provide palliative care at home, just as the Mary Potter Hospice does through Calvary. The Australian Institute of Health and Welfare's 2020 report on palliative care services found that South Australia had one palliative care medicine physician and 11.3 palliative care nurses per 100,000 people. As of 2018. The national standard is 2 palliative care physicians per 200,000 people. Right now, we can't even meet the minimum threshold for palliative care in this state, and there is much room for improvement in South Australia. We've heard in many of the contributions that the passing of VAD legislation will give peace of mind to South Australians. I have no doubt to a certain extent that is true, but I also know that better palliative care will also provide that peace of mind. And if we are, as a parliament, going to progress a VAD bill, it cannot be at the expense of palliative care and see a reduction in those services. And in fact, it should spur our desire to do more in that space to ensure that if this VAD legislation is passed, it becomes the absolute last resort option. And that concern about lack of palliative care feeds into some of the other concerns that many have in this bill, including myself, is around protection for vulnerable people. Right now, in debate across Australia, we are talking, and we've just had a Royal Commission into aged care and elder abuse. We've had a Royal Commission about the abuse of people with disability. We're coming on the back of the failures of Oakden. We have the Anne-Marie Smith case. These are all tragic cases where the state has failed to adequately protect the most vulnerable. And indeed, once again, we need to be looking at resources for the most vulnerable, not taking away those choices. The Australian Medical Association advocates for relevant legislation to protect vulnerable patients, such as those who may be coerced or may be susceptible to undue influence, or those who may consider themselves to be a burden to their families, carers or society if euthanasia is permitted, as the AMA says. And indeed, Labor Senator Pat Dodson remains concerned that Indigenous Australians will be adversely affected, adding to fears and lack of education about medicine and doctors while they continue to battle worse healthcare outcomes, he goes on to state. And of course, there are also similar concerns for people who English is a second language, and I know through my own migrant background family, that is a big concern for many. As the member for Narungga touched in his contribution, this bill is permitting for the state to become involved with taking of life, no matter how noble and how much that decision comes from a place of love. We are having this debate at the same time when we are looking at whole issues around mental health and ensuring that every life matters, and that debate is had. And of course, as we've seen in the Victorian example, with the passing of VAD legislation, we haven't necessarily seen a reduction in recorded suicides, and there quite often has been an argument made that if we have VAD legislation, we won't see these sad occurrences happening in terms of people taking their own life. I believe if we don't have these important proper debates around end-of-life care and the value of supporting someone through all their stages of life, we are sending very much mixed messages through our society. We've seen in countries like Belgium and Netherlands that initial limitations and that in those two countries of only allowing euthanasia for terminally ill has naturally expanded to include other people and other groups of people as legislation has progressed. And indeed, we have seen this most recently in Canada, where VAD was passed, and before that bill was assented, we already saw amendments being drafted for further liberalisation of that. So I think that as we progress this debate into the second reading, it is something that we are very, very mindful of. It is a natural part for us to ensure that we do have those safeguards in there, and to naturally think that there are strengths in this bill that will ever stop there from being abuse of such legislation. I think is something we should always be very careful of going down that path. And there's certainly many issues that I like to explore in the debate around the role of practitioners in this. And in terms of the two-doctor framework. Another matter that I'll be also supporting in terms of the committee stage is around conscientious objections for institutions, and I believe the member for Devonport has already tabled amendments to that extent. Of course, like all members of Parliament, I myself have received an incredible amount of correspondence from my constituents, both those who are strong proponents of VAD legislation and those who share many concerns, and I want to thank my community for as many others have indicated, for engaging this debate in the most respectful manner. But for me, the passage of this bill might provide some people with greater end-of-life choice, but in its current form, if passed, I believe will expose vulnerable South Australians who can't even access the very best of palliative care services at the moment.